To Osprey, the four-star general lifted his crystal glass above the crowd, and the ballroom went completely still. Then he smiled, and the next words out of his mouth made my husband choke on his bourbon. She saved every career in this room. For a heartbeat, nobody breathed. Then more than 200 military leaders, Pentagon officials, retired generals, and defense executives rose to their feet at once. The applause hit like a wave. I could hear glasses rattling, chairs scraping back across the marble, and dozens of heads turning toward me, toward the woman who had spent the entire evening being introduced as nobody in particular. Across the table, my husband, Daniel, coughed so hard into his napkin that his eyes watered. His face had gone the color of chalk. 20 minutes earlier, he had leaned in close enough that only I could hear him. Try not to embarrass me tonight. These people are out of your league. I hadn't forgotten a single syllable. And as the ovation rolled on around us, I found myself wondering whether he remembered saying it too. Somewhere behind me, the string quartet had stopped playing, as though even the musicians sensed this wasn't a moment to compete with. The chandeliers scattered small fractured rainbows across the tablecloths. A champagne flute tipped over at a nearby table, and nobody so much as glanced at it, because every face in that room had turned toward the same corner. Toward me. But to understand that night, you have to go back further than that. My name is Margaret Ellison. Everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 61 years old, and I gave 30 years of my life to the United States Army, most of it inside military intelligence. There are things I still can't talk about, missions that remain sealed, names I'll carry to my grave, decisions that quietly reshape people's lives without those people ever knowing my name. But this isn't really a story about classified operations. It's a story about something far more ordinary, something that happens in kitchens and living rooms across the country every single day. It's a story about becoming invisible to the one person who was supposed to see you clearest. Daniel and I had been married for 34 years. We met before either of us had a career worth mentioning, before the promotions, before our kids, before mortgages and retirement funds, and every complication that comes with a life built together. Back then, he was proud of my ambition. He drove 3 hours to watch me get promoted. He wrote me letters overseas that I still have in a shoebox, the ink gone soft and blurred at the folds from being read too many times. He used to introduce me at parties by rank before he introduced me by name, like the title itself was something worth bragging about. For a long time, we were a team. That's what I believed anyway. The shift wasn't sudden. It was more like paint peeling, slow enough that you don't notice until the wall underneath is showing. After I retired, Daniel built a name for himself in defense consulting, and he was genuinely good at it. Sharp, magnetic, easy to like. The invitations started coming: galas, fundraisers, military appreciation dinners, and every year his reputation grew a little taller while somehow, my own service shrank a little smaller in the retelling. At first it was small things. Someone would ask what I used to do, and before I could open my mouth, Daniel would answer for me. Oh, she worked for the government. 30 years folded into 4 words. I'd smile and let it slide. Then it became a punchline. Don't get Maggie talking about her old job, she'd have to silence the whole table. People laughed. I laughed along with them until the 100th time it stopped being funny at all. One dinner party, a retired colonel asked where I'd served. Before I answered, Daniel jumped in. Trust me, nothing exciting. The colonel's eyebrows lifted just slightly and something in me cracked. Nothing exciting? I'd missed birthdays and anniversaries and Christmas mornings. I'd watched my children grow up in photographs mailed to a base overseas. Nothing exciting? I never argued. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. Another time, at a neighbor's barbecue, someone noticed the faint scar along my forearm and asked how I'd gotten it. Daniel answered before I'd even set down my drink. Gardening accident, he said, and everyone laughed, including me, because contradicting him in front of a yard full of people felt like more trouble than it was worth. It wasn't a gardening accident. But every small erasure left a mark of its own, the way water eventually wears a groove into stone. Then the invitation arrived, the annual Defense Leadership Gala, one of the most prestigious events in Washington's military circles. Retired generals, active duty command, senior officials, everyone in their finest uniforms and polished shoes. Daniel lit up when he saw it. We should go, he said. You mean you should go, I reply. Ed, no, he said breezy like it cost him nothing. You can come with me. You can come with me, not we'll go together. Like I was an accessory he was deciding whether to bring. I looked at him and realized he had no idea what he'd just said. That somehow hurt more than the joke ever had. In the days before the gala, I nearly stayed home. I truly considered it, but something in me had quietly shifted, not anger, something calmer and more resolute. I was tired of proving myself, tired of correcting the record, tired of reminding my own husband who I was. So I decided I would go. I would wear the dress I'd bought and never worn. I would smile, and for one night I would stop explaining myself to anyone. If people recognized me, fine. If they didn't, that was fine too. I wasn't going there to be seen. I was long past needing anyone's permission to matter. The night of the gala, Daniel straightened his tie in the mirror and barely glanced my way. As we stepped into the ballroom, glittering with uniforms and rows of medals catching the light, he leaned in one more time. Try not to embarrass me. These people are out of your league. I looked at him, smiled, and said nothing at all. Because in 20 minutes, this entire room was going to learn something my husband had forgotten years ago. So would he. The ballroom was staggering, crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls, the low hum of conversation, the clink of glasses under soft jazz, waiters weaving between tables with trays balanced at their shoulders. Somewhere near the stage, a photographer was setting up equipment for the evening's official portraits. I ran my hand along the back of a gilded chair and thought, absurdly, about how many rooms like this I had stood in over the years without anyone ever knowing my name. I followed Daniel through the crowd or trailed behind him, really, because that's what it felt like. Everyone knew him. Contractors, retired officers, officials, he moved through the room like he owned it, and every time someone's eyes landed on me, the introduction was identical. This is my wife, Maggie. Nothing more. No mention of my service, my rank, the 3 decades I'd spent in uniform. Just Maggie. A retired admiral asked how we'd met, and Daniel told the whole story before I could get a word in. Everyone laughed. Then the admiral turned to me. And what did you do before all this? I opened my mouth. Daniel got there first. Government work, he said, then added with a wink, trust me, she doesn't love talking about it. The group chuckled politely. I smiled the smile I'd perfected over the years. The one women wear when correcting the record would only make the room more uncomfortable for everyone but him. Inside, though, something ached. Not because strangers didn't know my history. Because my husband did, and he'd decided it didn't matter. I slipped away toward the tall windows at the edge of the room, took a glass of champagne from a passing tray, and watched the city lights shimmer against the dark. There's a reason I never talked much about my career. People assume secrecy is glamorous, but mostly it's just lonely. Years earlier, before retirement, I'd been pulled onto a small intelligence team chasing down a crisis overseas. The specifics are still sealed, but here's what I can say. A handful of senior officers had been about to act on intelligence that was badly, dangerously wrong. If it had gone forward, careers would have ended. Reputations would have been shredded. My team worked around the clock for months, barely sleeping, surviving on vending machine coffee, and the kind of adrenaline that only comes from knowing real careers hung on what we found next. We cross-checked sources until our eyes blurred. We argued over conclusions until 2 in the morning, more nights than I can count. And eventually, piece by piece, we found the truth and proved it before the damage was done. The men whose careers we'd quietly saved never spoke of it publicly. Neither did I. That's simply how the work goes. You finish the job and you move on, and the mission matters more than the credit. At least, that's what I'd always told myself. A ripple of laughter across the room pulled me back. Daniel was holding court again, easy and confident, completely in his element. Then I noticed a man had stopped mid-stride, staring at me. He was around 70 tall, with the kind of posture that never quite leaves career officers. For a second I didn't place him. Then I did. General Thomas Whitfield, retired now, but once one of the most respected men in the Pentagon. He crossed the room straight toward me, not toward Daniel. Toward me. Maggie Ellison, he said, shaking his head. Good Lord, it's been almost 15 years. We talked for several minutes, family, grandchildren, the usual small talk 2 old colleagues fall into after too many years apart. He asked whether I still kept in touch with anyone from the old unit. I told him. I did occasionally, over holiday cards that said less than they meant to. He laughed and said some things never change. But underneath the small talk, there was something steady in his eyes the entire time. Respect that couldn't be faked, the kind that only comes from years of earning it the hard way. Another officer joined us, then another, until I was surrounded by faces I hadn't seen in decades, all of them looking at me like I mattered. Across the room, Daniel watched, visibly confused but not yet concerned, more like a man watching a scene he didn't understand the punchline to. He wandered over once. General Whitfield greeted him warmly, then turned right back to me and kept talking. I almost felt sorry for Daniel. He had no idea what was coming. A soft bell rang, calling everyone back to their seats. The chairman stepped to the podium as the room quieted. Before we continue tonight's program, he said, there's someone in this room we'd like to recognize. My stomach dropped. Across the room, General Whitfield caught my eye and smiled. This had been planned, clearly, and somehow no one had warned me. Many years ago, the chairman continued, a crisis threatened the careers and reputations of several leaders sitting in this very room tonight. The room listened, rapt. Daniel sipped his bourbon beside me, still oblivious. Then the chairman turned toward the front table. General Coleman, a four-star general, rose, the kind of man whose presence alone straightens spines across a room. He accepted the microphone, looked slowly around the ballroom, and raised his glass. To Osprey. For one suspended second, nothing happened. Then recognition broke across dozens of faces at once. Not everyone knew the name, but enough did. The applause started near the front and spread like fire through dry grass until the whole ballroom was on its feet, chairs scraping, glasses clinking, a few people even whistling. I lowered my eyes, overwhelmed. Beside me, Daniel had gone rigid, glancing between me and the stage, utterly lost. General Coleman waited for the room to settle. Most of you already know the story, he said, and a few people laughed softly, though she'd never tell it herself. More laughter, because it was true, I never had. 20 years ago, a small intelligence team uncovered something that stopped one of the worst professional disasters many of us in this room would ever have faced. The room fell quieter. Every eye had shifted from him to me. Daniel slowly lowered his glass. I stared at the tablecloth, wishing the floor would open beneath me, but General Coleman wasn't finished. There are officers in this room who made mistakes, he said, a few uneasy chuckles. Officers who acted on bad intelligence. Officers who would have lost everything, rank, reputation, careers, if that information hadn't been corrected in time. The room went utterly silent. Then he raised his glass one final time. She saved every career in this room. This time, there was no applause at first, just stunned quiet, and then something even stronger. The entire room stood a second time, longer and louder than before. The chairman clapped. Retired generals clapped. Men who had commanded thousands of soldiers were on their feet clapping for a woman most of them had walked past an hour earlier without a second glance. People who had spent entire careers earning respect were standing to give it to me. Somewhere across the room, a woman wiped her eyes. An older man near the bar raised his glass a second time, quietly, just for himself. Beside me, Daniel actually choked on his drink, grabbing his napkin, his face cycling from red to white and back to red. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. General Coleman let the room settle before adding one last line. The remarkable thing isn't what she did. A pause. It's that she never once asked for recognition afterward. His eyes found mine. She just went back to work. Something about those words hit harder than anything else that night because they were simply true. I'd never wanted a toast or a title. I'd done a job, the way thousands of service members do every single day without anyone ever raising a glass to them. After that, people kept coming, a retired admiral shaking my hand and calling me colonel, a former Pentagon official saying she wanted to thank me for years, an officer joking that his own promotion would have vanished without me. One woman I didn't recognize simply took my hand in both of hers and said, "My husband made it home because of what your team found. I've wanted to say thank you for 11 years. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just squeezed her hands back. With every handshake, Daniel seemed to shrink a little further into his chair. For years, he'd introduced me as a woman who worked for the government. Now some of the most respected people in the country were lining up to speak to me, not him. When General Whitfield finally reached our table, he shook my hand warmly, then turned to Daniel with a slight frown. "You never told us she was your wife." A few people laughed, not unkindly, just genuinely surprised. Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For maybe the first time in 3 decades of marriage, my husband had absolutely nothing to say. The drive home was silent in a way that felt different from our usual quiet, heavier, like something sitting between us that refused to move. Daniel drove. I watched the city blur past the window. Nearly 20 minutes passed before he cleared his throat. "Maggie?" "Yes, I didn't know." Simple words and somehow completely insufficient. "You didn't know what?" I asked. His hands tightened on the wheel. "Any of it." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was staggering. 34 years into our marriage, and he was only now admitting he didn't know his own wife. "You never asked," I said quietly. He flinched. The truth tends to do that. Outside the window, we passed the exit for the restaurant where he'd proposed, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a man could remember every detail of the night he asked me to marry him and forget almost everything about the woman he actually married. We didn't speak again until we reached the kitchen table, the same table where we'd celebrated birthdays, argued over bills, helped our kids with homework. Tonight it felt like foreign territory. Daniel stared at his hands. "I'm sorry," he finally said. I nodded but didn't answer because apologies come easy. Understanding takes longer. What happened to us? He asked, and he genuinely looked confused, as if the answer had appeared out of nowhere instead of building for years. What happened, I said, is that you stopped seeing me. His eyes widened. You didn't stop loving me, I continued, and his shoulders eased until I added, but you stopped seeing me? I told him about the dinner parties, the interruptions, the jokes, every small moment where a question meant for me had been answered by him instead. I wasn't accusing him. I was simply describing what had actually happened. By the end, he looked exhausted. I never meant to hurt you, he said. I know, I answered. That's the saddest part. I know you didn't. Daniel wasn't cruel or malicious. What had worn me down was quieter than that neglect, assumption, the slow complacency of believing there was nothing left to learn about the person across the table. The next morning, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. General Whitfield called at 9, apologizing for the surprise but not for the toast. Another officer called an hour later, then another, each one warmer than the last, each one asking whether the old team ever still got together for reunions. Warm, familiar conversations, full of memory and respect, and Daniel heard every one of them. By early afternoon, I found him sitting quietly, the television on but unwatched, clearly somewhere deep in his own thoughts. When the phone rang again, a retired three-star this time, he asked, almost cautiously, what did he want? To say hello, I said. A few moments passed. Then he asked the question I'd waited years to hear. What exactly did you do? Not sarcastic, not a punchline, genuinely curious. For a second I couldn't speak because after all that time, he was finally asking. We talked for hours that afternoon. Nothing classified, just the human parts of the job, the loneliness, the pressure, the sacrifices, the quiet victories nobody ever heard about. Daniel listened. Really listened without interrupting, without reaching for his phone. At one point his eyes filled up. I had no idea, he said, and I believed him because if he had known, he never would have spoken to me the way he had for all those years. As the sun dropped low, he looked at me, actually at me, for the first time in longer than I could remember. Can I have one more chance to get this right? For a moment, I didn't see the polished consultant who loved being the center of a room. I saw the young man I'd married 3 decades earlier, finally ready to learn who his wife had become. Nothing changed overnight. That's not how real repair works. There was no dramatic speech, no grand gesture, no single moment that undid years of feeling erased. Instead, it was small things, stacked one on top of another. A week after the gala, Daniel asked if we could just have breakfast, no agenda. He asked real questions, what my hardest deployment had been, what I'd missed most while I was gone, whether I'd ever been afraid, and he waited for the answers instead of filling the silence himself. He asked about the friends I'd lost touch with, the commanders I'd respected, the ones I hadn't. He wanted to know what it felt like to come home after months away and have to relearn the rhythm of a house that had kept moving without you. Some mornings we sat so long the coffee went cold twice over before either of us noticed. Ed, the more we talked, the clearer it became. He wasn't discovering a new version of me. He was rediscovering the version he'd simply stopped noticing. One afternoon, sorting through boxes in the attic, dust drifting in the light from the small round window, he found an old photo from the day I made Colonel Me in dress uniform, younger, grinning in a way I barely recognized anymore. He stared at it for a long moment. I can't believe I forgot what this meant to you, he said. You didn't forget, I told him. You just stopped paying attention. The old Daniel might have gotten defensive. This one just nodded because he knew it was true. That honesty became the foundation for everything after. Over the following months, our conversations deepened, not just about my service, but about his own fears and regrets, the things he'd never said out loud either. I came to understand that for years he'd measured his own worth by visibility, by how loudly a room applauded him. If something wasn't public, it hadn't felt real to him. That night at the gala had cracked that belief wide open, because some of the most important things a person does happen without any applause at all, sometimes without even the people closest to them knowing. Months later, we went to a small local veterans event, folding chairs, coffee and paper cups, a table of donated cookies nobody had quite finished decorating, nothing fancy at all. It was the kind of gathering I'd always secretly preferred to the galas, the kind where nobody was there to be seen, only to remember together. Daniel had come without being asked, which itself said something. A woman in her 70s approached, shook my hand, and thanked me for my service. What branch? She asked. Before I could answer, Daniel spoke quietly, naturally, without performance. Army, he said. My wife served 30 years. Then, with a warm, unguarded smile, you should hear what she actually did. I looked at him, and for a moment the whole room seemed to fall away. There was no self-interest in it, no borrowed credit, just pride, plain and real, the kind I'd waited years to hear in his voice. As the woman walked off, Daniel turned to me. I finally understand something, he said. The most remarkable person in my life was sitting right beside me this whole time. I laughed. Took you long enough? Yeah, he admitted. It did. We stood there together, older, a little wiser, and far more honest than we'd been in years. It wasn't the gala that saved our marriage. It was the truth that followed it, the willingness to actually listen, the courage to admit what had been missed, and the choice, finally, to see each other again. Some nights, even now, I catch Daniel watching me across the kitchen table the way he used to when we were young, before either of us had anything to prove to the other. It isn't dramatic. It's just attention, offered freely, which turns out to be the rarest gift two people can give each other after 30-some years. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. The people we love often carry entire histories we've simply stopped noticing, not because they're hidden, but because we've quietly stopped looking. A parent's old career, a friend's quiet sacrifice, a spouse's unspoken years. We assume we already know the whole story, and so we stop asking, and the person right beside us slowly becomes a stranger we only think we recognize. If this made you think of someone in your own life, a spouse, a parent, a friend, someone who served, take a moment and actually ask them about their story. Not the polite version, the real one. You might be surprised by what you find sitting right beside you. Because respect shouldn't have to wait for a ballroom full of strangers to hand it out on your behalf. It should start at home, at your own kitchen table, long before anyone else ever thinks to raise a glass.